Am I good to go? Oh, great. I'm like, hey, I was waiting on here. Anyway, hello everyone. My name is Dr. Nicholas Hudson, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you all to the inaugural lecture series here in the 2021-2022 International Leadership Series. This year, our theme is Dignity and Justice, Fulfilling the Human Rights Promise. The International Leadership Series is a joint event between the Office of Student Orientation, Leadership, and Engagement and the TAMIU International Engagement Office. Part of the International Leadership Series is helping students and attendees understand what is the different elements of being a global citizen. And so each year, our theme for the International Leadership Series changes. 2 years ago, in 2019-2020, we focused on sustainable development. Last year, we focused on social justice and equity. This year, we're focusing all of our lecture series on human rights. Next year, our focus will be on peace and conflict. The following year is identity and diversity, and finally, power and governance, and globalization and interdependence. All 7 of these elements are what we hope students here at TAMIU, faculty, staff, and community members will be able to gather from our series. And so for those of the students here in the room, part of one of our signature leadership programs here at the institution is the International Leadership Fellows Program, where students can attend 5 out of the 6 International Leadership Series and complete reflective prompts about what was discussed. They will also participate in the Art for Social Change event in spring 2022. And if they complete these lectures and they do the prompts, etc., they are recognized at the Emerging Leader Celebration and provided with an International Leaders Medal. It's one of the more prestigious levels of honors here that we have here at the institution. So this year, our theme is on human rights, and human rights are rights that we simply have because we exist as human beings. They are not granted by any state, right? And so this is the baseline definition that we are going to continue all the way through all of our series to actually have. Part of human rights are 3 components. Human rights are universal and inalienable. We are all equally entitled to our human rights, and they should not be taken away from us unless there is due process through the court system. They are indivisible and interdependent. One set of rights cannot be enjoyed fully without the other. So if we are to make progress in civil and political rights, it then makes it easier for us to exercise economic, social, and cultural rights. And then finally, human rights are equal and non-discriminatory. We are all born, everyone in this world should be born free and equal in dignity and rights. And then freedom from discrimination is what ensures this, right? Equality under the law. And so today, we turn our attention to our first series, which is Femicide, an ongoing challenge for human rights in Latin America. And we are very pleased to bring back Dr. Pamela Newman, who is an assistant professor of sociology here at TAMIU. Dr. Newman has been a lecturer for us in 2019, and it's an interesting topic that I think is relevant across the board. Dr. Newman received their bachelor's degree from Trinity University, and then their master's and doctorate at the University of Texas at Austin. They teach a lot of courses related to sociology and gender, and I'm sure Dr. Newman will be absolutely explaining her research as it relates to femicide and some of those ongoing rights that we're seeing throughout Latin America. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Pamela Newman as she comes up to the stage. And we switch over the PowerPoints real quick. Mike, you can take those off. All right, there we go.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It is an honor for me to return. I must have done something right the first time they invited me back. I'm very pleased to be here to kick off this series on human rights for TAMIU this year, and I'm here to discuss a very serious and unfortunately ongoing problem in Latin America and really throughout the world. My geographic focus in this talk will be on Latin America, but it's important to acknowledge that women are being killed all over the world for a variety of reasons, and this problem throughout the pandemic has really only been exacerbated. And so what I'm going to do in this talk is talk a little bit about the definitions of femicide and feminicide. I will give some background on femicide laws in Latin America, the history of how we got to the point where there are legislative protections for women who are murdered, and some of the reasons why those laws have been passed, a little bit of data on femicide rates in the region, some of the causes or the roots, trying to understand where does this problem come from. And then, as Dr. Hudson mentioned, I do research myself in Latin America, specifically in Nicaragua, and so I will be talking a little bit about the case of Nicaragua specifically, and what's been going on with femicide laws in Nicaragua and how those laws have been unfortunately undermined by the state in the last several years. And then I'll offer some concluding reflections to wrap up, and of course I welcome your questions and comments at the end of this presentation. So first of all, let's start off by talking a little bit about what is femicide and what is feminicide. So femicide, or femicidio in Spanish, is the killing of females by males because they are female. This was the original definition developed by scholars in the United States, Radford and Russell. And later on, that definition was expanded by a Mexican feminist anthropologist named Marcela Lagarde. And she came up with this term feminicidio because she really felt like it was important not only to acknowledge the fact that women are being murdered as a class, as a category of people, but that the state itself, governments, are complicit in these murders because of the impunity or the lack of justice that women who are murdered receive in these cases. And it's also important to note that this definition does not mean that all killings of women are feminicides or feminicidios. These are specifically killings of women that have gender-based motives. The killings are related to women's condition as women. So how did we get to a point in Latin America where we have legislation that addresses feminicide or femicide? Well, to understand that, we have to go back a couple of decades and understand sort of the trajectory of global human rights activism around the world. And one of the most important landmarks was the 1993 United Nations Declaration on Violence Against Women. This was really the first time that the UN had made a specific statement about this social problem. And shortly thereafter, we see the ratification of the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women, which is commonly known as Belém do Pará. And this was the first legally binding treaty to address violence against women. It was a treaty that was signed by virtually all countries in Latin America. So it's an Inter-American Convention. The United States, notably, is not a signatory to this convention, which is an interesting thing to reflect on why that might be the case, but it's beyond the scope of my talk today. And another important component of the Belém do Pará Convention is that it introduced this principle called the due diligence principle. And that principle meant that states were obligated to exercise due diligence in the investigation and prosecution of violence against women. And it also established a system for citizens themselves to directly petition the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Inter-American Court should there be no resolution or action taken after petitions made it through the Commission's process. And finally, because of these particular legal steps that were taken, there was finally a case that made it all the way through this Inter-American system process, which resulted in the very first femicide case receiving a ruling in a case involving the murders of several women in Mexico. The case was popularly known as the Cotton Field Murders case, and it was based on the murders of women in Ciudad Juarez. And the Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruled that Mexico was responsible to provide reparations to the families and the communities affected by these murders due to their lack of due diligence in addressing these murders. And so that judgment set off a new wave of local and transnational organizing in Mexico as well as all throughout Latin America to really demand that legislation in the region addressing violence against women become more comprehensive. Originally, laws on domestic violence in Latin America were mostly focused on very narrow definitions of what domestic violence consisted of. And so it might be, rape or sexual violence or physical violence, but there was not a wide spectrum of violences acknowledged, and there was certainly no specific acknowledgement that the murder of women deserved its own category of legal recognition. And so this judgment in this Inter-American Court of Human Rights case really provoked sort of this round of legislating across the region, so not only in Mexico, but throughout Latin America. And local and transnational feminist organizations were able to use that judgment along with the principles outlined in the Belém do Pará Convention to essentially advocate for this new legislation. And they engaged in a strategy that's popularly known as naming and shaming, sort of a boomerang strategy where they would make the facts of these cases known, the murders of women known outside of their countries, and international NGOs and other human rights organizations would get involved to start building awareness about these cases and the need for greater state response. Another critical factor in the advance of legislation on femicide was the development of women's policy machineries inside the state. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by the women's policy machinery is that women themselves within the legislatures of these countries were advocates for this legislation themselves. And this was particularly the case in Mexico, where there were a number of elected leaders, elected officials who sat on these commissions and these committees and were instrumental in pushing forward this legislation sort of inside the nitty-gritty bureaucracy of the state. Now, what does femicide consist of? Well, there's a number of modalities that we can consider when we're talking about femicide, and I have listed all of those there on the screen. So I'm not going to say all of them out loud, it's quite a long list, but the point of this illustration is to show that femicide is not only about those murders of women that are committed by an intimate partner. The definition of femicide is such that it is meant to encompass the murders of women because they are women, even outside of that context, in non-intimate contexts, and due to other sorts of situations as well. And it's also important to recognize that even though as a region, these forms of femicide are sometimes all incorporated, in not all countries are all of these modalities encompassed in their legislation. And particularly it's important to note that often trans women are excluded because of the ways that these laws are written. They don't necessarily always define trans women as women. So that presents some obstacles for human rights in those cases. What about the data? What do we know about the prevalence of femicide throughout Latin America? This is some recent data that I pulled from the United Nations. It's a couple years old now, but there you can see, and not all countries in the region are represented, only those countries that actually report their data. This is another ongoing challenge. Sometimes we don't have adequate statistics to really understand the full scope of the problem. But what we can see there in terms of the raw numbers is that, not surprisingly, Brazil and Mexico are two of the countries with the highest raw numbers of femicides in the region. If we were to flip over that screen, I won't do that, but I'll just tell you, if we were to flip over to the rate per 100,000 women, though, we would see that actually the rates of femicide in Latin America are highest in Central American countries like Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador. because even though their populations are smaller, there's a higher percentage of women being murdered in those countries. So why are women being murdered? What are the roots? How can we understand the causes of femicide in Latin America? There are so many things to talk about when it comes to understanding the complexity of this problem. I'm only going to really touch on the very sort of surface level of each of these points, but I think they're all critical to understanding how we got to the situation that we are in today. So first of all, you can't understand femicide in Latin America without understanding legacies of colonialism. During the 400 to 500 years of colonialism throughout Latin America, women were treated as property. There was rampant rape and sexual violence of indigenous women and enslaved women, and really a culture of entitlement to women's bodies that persists even to this day. Once the independence of most of the region was achieved, unfortunately, we see decades of state violence occurring. In other words, the violence of the state toward its own population. For example, the massacres of indigenous populations, including women and children. We have periods of civil war and political conflict. And during these conflicts, often sexual violence toward women is utilized as a weapon of war. This is particularly evident in the case of the 30-year genocide of indigenous people in Guatemala and during the political conflict in Peru, when the Shining Path, those of you who are familiar with Latin American history may know the Shining Path. Its founder actually just recently passed away. But this is one of the tools that organization used as a tool of terrorism to instill sort of sexual terrorism within the population. And so these are ongoing forms of sexual violence that have been occurring. Now, on top of that, more recently, when we start talking about globalization, we get into the 1990s and the early 2000s, we start seeing how global economic processes, particularly free trade, has led to patterns of migration that has heightened particular kinds of vulnerability for women. And NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was passed in 1994, is an ongoing example of this. As a result of that agreement, there was mass migration of women, often young single women, from southern Mexico to the border, to northern Mexico, where they were often far away from their families and friends and their connections, and that left them more exposed to potentially be abused and taken advantage of in many ways, not only as workers, but also as women and sexually as well. Sort of alongside of that, particularly in countries like Mexico, we see the intersection of sexual violence with other forms of criminal violence, such as gangs and cartels, where cartels and gangs use women as sort of leverage to achieve their own political or economic goals. And then we also see state complicity in this, where in some cases you have state actors who are also sort of involved in these cartels themselves. And I think this is particularly relevant in the case of Mexico. Finally, more generally, we have an ongoing patriarchal system of beliefs and practices in which men consistently have greater power socially, economically, culturally than women, and women are structurally subordinate to men. And what do I mean by structurally subordinate? What I mean is that throughout society, there is a consistent way in which women are kept down or made to be inferior to men, whether that's in terms of economic opportunities or social status or how the law is treating them. And so as a result of that structural subordination, hegemonic ideas about the roles of men and women, about masculinity in particular, enables the devaluation and the perceived disposability of women. They aren't seen as fully human, as Dr. Hudson mentioned at the outset of this presentation today. They aren't actually seen as fully human with all the rights that that status should include. Now, what can we say about how all of this applies in a particular case? So I want to talk a little bit about Nicaragua. And I don't have time, unfortunately, to go into all the history of this country. I just want to note that I did actually live there for several years before I completed my graduate work, and so I have both a personal and a professional connection to this country that goes back almost 2 decades now. Nicaragua is a country that was ruled by a dictatorship for 40 years, and in the late 1970s and 1979, the Sandinistas were able to overthrow that dictatorship and took over the leadership of the country. Their victory was met with a form of U.S. opposition that included both economic sanctions and military intervention to basically try to crush the Sandinista movement. That resulted in the 1980s being sort of a decade of economic and political and social destruction for the country. But to make a long story short, eventually the leader of the Sandinista movement, Daniel Ortega, came back into power in 2007, and he has been there ever since. And during that time, he has progressively consolidated power and developed, paradoxically, a close alliance with the Catholic Church. And that has enabled him to really maintain power throughout a lot of this period. What's interesting to note is that even though we had this authoritarian leader and somebody who was not necessarily friendly to feminist ideas or feminist priorities, local feminist organizations in Nicaragua, combined with outside pressure, were able to achieve the passage of a very important piece of legislation in Nicaragua that included femicidio, the codification of femicidio for the first time in Nicaragua. And here in Article 9, I put the text of how they define that crime there. The crime of feminicidio is committed by the man that in the framework of unequal power relations, note that, unequal power relations, between men and women, cause the death of a woman in the public or private sphere. So note the comprehensive nature of that definition. It acknowledges the power relations that I just finished speaking about, and it also acknowledges that these murders can be committed in the home and outside of it. It does not limit the definition in any way to the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. Another key dimension of this law is that it established specialized prosecutors in courts to hear all of these gender violence cases. Now, unfortunately, this law did not become fully implemented, in part due to financial reasons, but also because there was a substantial religious and political backlash to its passage. Religious leaders called the law 779 the new number of the beast, which those of us who have some familiarity with Christian texts may know 666 is supposedly the number of the beast. So they were, extrapolating from that to make this law seem like it was demonic in some way. And men's rights organizations came out and called it an attack on men. And so this backlash led to a number of modifications to the law more generally and more broadly. But what I want to focus on for the purpose of this talk is how they modified the legal definition of femicide. In 2014, just a year and a half after the legislation was passed, the definition of femicide was changed by a presidential decree, not by legislative action, to only count intimate partners, the murders of women by their intimate partners, in the private sphere. So that obviously vastly limits the murders of women that are being considered femicides. And what's paradoxical in some ways is that Chief Justice Alba Luz Ramos, who's pictured there with President Ortega, she was one of the instrumental people behind the initial passage of this legislation, but in the end, she was defending this more circumscribed or limited definition. And this is an actual translation of something she said. She said, "A dead woman is a dead woman. In the end, it doesn't matter what it's called." And this was surprising, again, because she was somebody who had really been supporting feminist organizing and advocacy on this issue of femicide and gender-based violence for a long time. Now, feminists were, of course, as you can imagine, quite outraged by these changes. And while I was doing my field work, my research in Nicaragua several years ago, I attended a number of protests and demonstrations and workshops and strategizing sessions that these organizations had to try to put political pressure on the state to go back and undo these changes. And one of these feminist attorneys, Juanita Jimenez, made an extensive presentation at one of these talks that I attended, and I just want to share one of the things that she said about femicide and why it's so important to not limit the definition in the ways that the government decided to do so. She said, when we talk about violence in the law, it's important to recognize both the family sphere as well as the public sphere. It's not just in the street that rights should be respected, but also in the home and in family relationships. And the reason that Ms. Jimenez emphasized this point is because femicide, the use of femicide as a legal and as a political category, enables us to see, it makes visible the violent consequences of unequal power relationships between men and women. When we just have androgynous or androcentric categories where we just call all murders homicides and we don't break out these differences in the motivations for these murders and why they are occurring and who is being murdered and for what reasons, that invisibilizes the experiences of women specifically who are disproportionately being murdered because of their gender. Now, unfortunately, because of the authoritarian context in Nicaragua, all of these protests and these efforts, and even the efforts of human rights organizations and entities outside of Nicaragua, were unable to really put sufficient pressure on the Nicaraguan government to make any changes. And local grassroots organizations have continued to track the statistics using the original definition rather than the circumscribed one now used by the state. And according to these local grassroots organizations, during 2020 in Nicaragua, there were 71 femicides, which is more than there were in 2020, in 2019, and more than 2018. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that Nicaragua has become increasingly authoritarian throughout this time period. There was a dramatic citizen uprising in 2018 that was met with extreme government repression that was called a genocide by human rights observers. So this increasingly authoritarian situation has made it more and more dangerous for women because more and more of these crimes are going unprosecuted. As I was just saying, the Nicaraguan government has rejected all regional and international appeals to reinstate the original provisions of the law. Human rights activists are fleeing for their lives. The police are viewed as completely untrustworthy, as agents of an oppressive state rather than the investigators that will hopefully lead to justice. And there are no free and fair elections now in Nicaragua. There's an election that's supposed to be happening this fall, but there are no candidates that have been allowed to run against Daniel Ortega in the upcoming election. And so the question is, in the absence of political rights for the people of Nicaragua, how will women's rights be protected? Unfortunately, I think what we are going to see is an ongoing disregard for the lives and dignity of women. All right, let me offer some concluding thoughts. So does it matter that we have a category, femicidio, feminicidio, to analyze the deaths of women? I would say yes. My academic and professional and personal experience leads me to believe that it is incredibly important to count the deaths of women in these ways because it reveals the consequences of the gender division of resources and power in society. I think this case of Nicaragua specifically, however, highlights some of the challenges that we face when we rely on laws to protect human rights. We need more than laws to protect human rights. And the reason for that has to do with some of the intricacies of criminal penal codes and things of that nature. How do you prove a gender motive? What are the rules of evidence used? If we're talking about the entire social and cultural and political context that is subordinating women, how do you provide evidence of that that can be used to actually convict someone in a particular case? We have to acknowledge the challenges when it comes to enforcement, both at the national level and at the supranational level. So at the national level, law enforcement is often under-resourced, particularly those branches of law enforcement that are charged with protecting women specifically. I did research at a women's police station in Nicaragua several years ago, and they had one vehicle for 10 police investigators that they were supposed to share to investigate cases. Their computers were easily 20 to 30 years old. Everything they were doing was on paper, essentially. I mean, it was very clear that that was an under-resourced agency within the broader police force. So funding is a problem, but also enforcement at the level of the United Nations, the Inter-American Convention. Even though it is supposedly a legally binding treaty, it is not necessarily binding in the sense that the consequences that states face for failing to uphold these standards is really limited to the shame that they might feel for not upholding human rights by their own, in their own countries. We don't have other mechanisms other than economic sanctions, which most of the time end up harming the general population more than actually motivating governments to change their policies. And then we also have, accusations of sort of outsider intervention that, questioning the legitimacy of external human rights actors and institutions, calling it some sort of, interference from abroad, right? Rather than just the protection of rights that should be universally acknowledged. Okay. So I think we also have to acknowledge that femicide is incredibly important, but it's part of a continuum of violence. It's the most extreme manifestation of a continuum of violence in societies across the world. And until we address that entire continuum, we can't focus only on femicide, as important and as sobering as the reality of women being murdered is. We have to focus on, how we learn in the first place to treat one another from our youngest ages. How our interpersonal relationships are formed, how we resolve conflict, what we are taught about femininity and masculinity, how violence is normalized in the home, in the workplace, in all contexts in which we live. This is how we get to a point where women are eventually murdered, right? You could think of this in part as connected to ideas of rape culture, where we just normalize all forms of violence. And so, of course, naturally, we see its most extreme manifestations occurring more and more around us. Despite that bleak panorama, I think we have to acknowledge that we have some reasons to be hopeful and to be optimistic. And that is that human rights activists and feminist organizations, specifically in Latin America, are not giving up. There is an incredibly powerful movement in Latin America that some of you may have heard of. Ni una menos, ni una más, ni una muerta más. Not one more death. And these women, at great personal risk to themselves and their families, are continuing to go into the streets and demand justice for women. And that's what we need. We need more people in the streets. We need more people demanding justice, demanding that human rights be respected. We need more awareness. And that's really where the changes will happen. La lucha sigue adelante. Thank you. Dr. Hudson.
Yeah, so what we'll do now is we'll open it up for questions for Dr. Newman on femicide in Latin America. So we would love to get some questions from the folks in the audience. So if not, I have questions. Right. I would love to actually, this is such an interesting topic because I think you specifically focused in on Nicaragua, but we see, as you said at the end, ni uno menos, focusing in on other countries. Specifically, there's been a very large movement in Argentina, very large movement especially in Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, as it relates to femicide. And part of this, part of this challenge that I think that we're seeing is an increased focus on women's issues on a global scale through social media, and a lot of times state governments shutting down social media. And I'm looking specifically, if I'm not mistaken, at El Salvador with the government's controlling of the social media platforms and really limiting what's happening there. And so we look at Central America at large, we see a lot more immigration taking place, especially women coming up to the United States or attempting there. So what are we seeing, or what have you seen in your research, especially related to some of these authoritarian regimes beyond Nicaragua, but around some of that Central American countries that are there?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hudson. I mean, I think absolutely the main thing that we're seeing is women and human rights activists and women who are being threatened by violence fleeing their countries. And this is happening not just in Nicaragua. Nicaraguans are fleeing to Costa Rica, so we're not hearing about them here in the United States, but in the rest of Central America, they're fleeing here. And that has, you have to sort of trace that back to histories of migration that go back 30 years, where Guatemalans and Salvadorans and Hondurans have been coming to places in California and in Texas and in Florida for decades. And so they're fleeing to places where they have these extensive family networks to try to escape these situations. But instead of being able to actually even apply for asylum based on the situation of violence in their countries, they're being denied that opportunity. And I am not up to date on all of the most recent political developments in this regard, but I am aware that there are thousands of Central American migrants trapped on the other side of the border in Mexico because they're not even being allowed in to place an asylum claim on the basis of these violent situations in their countries.
Yeah, but if I'm not mistaken, there was a recent court ruling that said that the Biden administration had to maintain the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico policy as it related to amnesty for especially Central Americans as they were trying to navigate up here. And I think, as we look at this concept of human rights, one of the human rights in the UN Commission on Human, not UN Commission, but the UN Declaration of Universal Human Rights is the ability to freely travel to another country and seek amnesty and seek refuge as a way to protect oneself. And so what we're seeing here is this kind of internal political kind of debate in many ways, not necessarily focused on femicide, but focused more on immigration. And so this intersection of immigration and violence against women, so it's such an interesting kind of connection there, at least in my opinion, of how it's being framed in a political lens versus a humanitarian lens. Earlier today you had mentioned, the United States did not sign on to this agreement. Is there reasons why? Like, you didn't fully go into it, but I would love to hear why the United States did not agree to that.
The U.S. has a pattern of not signing on to the very instruments that it finds to be so important for other countries to sign on to. And a lot of that has to do with sort of the politics of U.S. sovereignty and wanting to feel like, well, our human rights situation in our country is good enough. We don't actually need to be bound by these instruments in the same way that these other countries that are deemed to have these legacies of massive human rights abuses and genocide, for example, that, they don't need to be held accountable in the same way. I mean, I would argue that that's ridiculous, to be frank, but it allows the U.S. to sort of maintain this position of perceiving itself as this shining city on a hill to which other countries should aspire, right? But if we look inside our own country, we see plenty of human rights violations. So that's another way that, if you want to be involved in human rights, think about how you could pressure our own government to actually uphold the standards that we expect other countries to uphold.
Great. Do we have any questions as well? Yep.
Hi. So you mentioned when you were speaking about Nicaragua that that the Catholic Church and the politicians have a very close relationship. Have you seen that the church has played a role, not just in Nicaragua, but in other areas as well with regard to femicide?
With regard to femicide specifically, the church has kind of stayed out of it for the most part. Where they've been more active is on broader questions of gender-based violence and the ways that legislation is framed. For example, One thing that the church was very against in the case of Nicaragua was eliminating the possibility of mediation or sort of these informal resolutions or agreements, right, between victims and perpetrators, because they were very focused on keeping the family together, right? And so in all instances, right, it's like forgiveness, like try to reconcile, like that kind of discourse is really the discourse that we hear from the church, I think, in general. Mm-hmm.
So their focus was on potentially the intimate partner violence.
Yes.
Not necessarily on the violence that happens outside of it.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for that question. I think in the back.
Just a quick question. I was wondering if you could speak to some of the nuances between the different definitions of this phenomenon and how they underlie, especially the gathering of statistics. So, for example, at the beginning, the idea of femicide is having like sort of a motive-based paradigm, right? Then the feminicide having the added component of state complicity, and then in the way the slide on law 779. It seemed to be not a motive-based paradigm at all, almost something closer to a situational or even a circumstantial way of thinking about it, right? Where if the murder is committed in a situation where there is a sort of a structural inequality between men and women, then this qualifies it as femicide. So I was just curious about like the statistics we started with, and more broadly, like the way in which these statistics are gathered, and is there a preferred definition? Do different bodies use different definitions when gathering the statistic? Those sort of nuanced questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a complex question because every
Sorry.
government, every government in Latin America is collecting statistics in its own way. And my interpretation of the way the statistics are gathered is that they rely on each individual country and what they report. So what the government officially reports is what, like when I showed that slide with the numbers across countries, that's just a compilation of what each government itself is reporting, and they're reporting that based on their legal definitions, which may or may not actually be sort of about the structural context. They may be more about motives, right? If you can prove a misogynistic motive, right, through like the sexual mutilation of a woman's body, that's clearly a femicide, versus if it's just a killing on the street, there's not necessarily evidence that that's gender-based. It might just be sort of a broader criminal act that isn't based on gender specifically, right? And so that's where some of the conflicts and the tensions come in to play. And also because half the countries in the region have adopted definitions based on the term femicidio, and the other half have adopted concepts based on feminicidio. But how that corresponds to sort of the emphasis on impunity at the theoretical level is actually different. You know, in the law, feminicidio and femicidio are more similar than they are at the abstract level of theory, where the emphasis is on impunity, if that makes sense. But thank you, that was a great question.
Thank you. Hello. So I know as students and even young people, sometimes we hear about these like large scale issues and we can't help but feel like helpless, or how can we contribute? We're so young. So what would you suggest that we can do as young people, or how could we contribute to this?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like such an overwhelming problem, right? And I think, especially when we hear about problems in other places that are far away, we think, well, these places and these people are so far away from me, like, what can I possibly do, right? So I think the focus should be for us, like, on our own local context, and like, what are we observing in our most immediate environment? Like, what's going on in your family? What's going on in your neighborhood? What's going on here at TAMIU? Like, what are the organizations here on campus that are advocating for gender equality? What are the organizations and opportunities to advocate for human rights here on campus, or to become more educated? What are some organizations that you can, you know, if you have some financial resources spare, to give to, right? If you care about immigration, you know, I could make some recommendations offline about that particular aspect, and I can, you know, provide some names of organizations to Dr. Hudson afterwards. But, you know, off the top of my head, I think the most important thing is to start with like the immediate situation around you, you know?
And I think coupled with that is really changing a mindset of not necessarily accepting things for the way they are, and the way they have been, especially here in Laredo and Nuevo Laredo, right? Like understanding that our city government has the capacity to recognize some of these cases as being femicide, right? And being gender-based, right? Like there was a recent arrest of an individual for the murder of his girlfriend and their unborn child, but it took almost 2 years for the police to actually make an arrest, right? Because they were the son of a detective, amongst other reasons. I'm not saying anything of that nature because I don't want to get in trouble, but I will say that, right, like holding folks accountable, holding your local elected officials accountable and saying, where is there not justice for these folks? Laredo has a very large human trafficking problem as it relates to us being the gateway city, but human trafficking in and of itself leads to a lot of areas of femicide. So taking action not only here at TAMIU, but holding your local elected officials accountable, holding your state legislators accountable, letting them know that this is a topic that they should be focusing on in the state legislature versus whatever topic that they may be focusing on that may be limiting of rights, things of that nature, right?
Yeah, and I would say also, we also have a local organization in town that helps women who have been victimized, thinking about gender violence more broadly, not only just femicide. Casa Misericordia, you may know, is a domestic violence shelter and does a lot of classes and provides a lot of resources to women who are in these situations. And so, if you have the ability to check out their website and call their office and find out like what you could do to help, I think they would welcome that as well, having, been involved with them myself. So thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Any other final questions? All right. Well, once again, let's give Dr. Newman a round of applause. And thank you once again for being able to illuminate our campus population on this very important, I think, timely topic. We're seeing continual movement as it relates to especially the Ni Uno Menos movement in Ciudad Juarez. I taught a class last spring where I'm able to see a lot of students be able to place a large focus on kind of what's going on there, and it's in some ways spreading. So I'm very appreciative of it. And this year, this concept of human rights, when we talk about not just femicide and women's violence against women, but there's also kind of an intersection of human rights violations as it relates to things. So as we continue throughout the year and have conversations, understanding that it's not just one violation of a human right sometimes that happens, that it's on multiple fronts, right? Yes. And so once again, thank you very much. For the students that are here, we will be handing out the vouchers for food for you all for coming today. It's an incentive for joining us. But once again, we'll see you next month as we have Dr. Aaron Olivas, who will be speaking about LGBT human rights violations in Latin America. And so that will be on October 15th at the same time. So we'll in the same place. So thank you once again and enjoy your rest of your weekend.
Thank you all very much. That was great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.